Hi, everyone. It's Carolyn Moor from the Modern Widows Club, and I am interviewing someone today, my friend, Reverend Blake Lasater. Thanks, Blake, for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Blake is with the Eureka Springs First United Methodist Church in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. It's a Northwest Arkansas area, in case you don't know that region of the world. And I'll just give you a little bit of history on Blake. Yesterday, we just started talking about pastors and widows ministries. And I have to confess that I've been friends with Blake for about 20 years. And actually, I met him when I was 6-month widowed. And he was the person who sort of got the brunt of all of my spiritual questions. Why would God allow this to happen? He was such a good man. Now my children don't have a father. And he still stayed my friend. And I've asked him a lot of hard questions over the years. But we kind of broke out into a conversation yesterday, and we're going to get to that. But first, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on Blake and basically his education and credentials. Like I said, he's the lead pastor here at Eureka Springs First United Methodist Church. He is married. Blake actually was a widower, and I'll let him tell a little bit of his story. I was widowed when I met him, and then 10 years later, he became a widower. And then I became someone who was there to be able to support his journey. Today, he's remarried to Mary Lou, and he has a daughter named Grace, who is 12. And his background, I'm just going to let Blake go ahead and speak up and talk about your educational background, because I think I had a little bit of information about you. You're a Navy veteran. You were a chaplain for 14 years, and you served in Iraq and Thailand and Japan and Crete. But that all came after your education. So give us a little bit of information on your background and how you got here.
So I have a double major in history and philosophy. I took that and went to seminary to get a master's of divinity. And then shortly after graduating there, I joined the U.S. Navy to become a chaplain and served time around the world, especially in Iraq. That's where I spent the majority of my time. That experience taught me a lot. We dealt with a lot of widows and widowers in the service and the needs they have. And then when I got out of the Navy, I was sent here to Eureka Springs to lead the church here. And earlier in my life, I had married, and we had spent 7 years together. And when I came back from Iraq, we not only adopted a daughter, but a few months after the adoption, we found out that my wife had pancreatic cancer. And it was a 3.5-year struggle, going through hospital appointments, doctor's appointments, trying to figure out what would happen. We kind of knew in the back of our heads where this was going to lead. And so we'd prepared a lot for that. But when she passed away, from my experience, after 3.5 years of caregiving and watching a woman I loved turn into somebody I really didn't know because of the painkillers and the disease, my grief process was delayed because I felt a sense of relief. I was no longer staying up all night with her and then taking care of my daughter during the day and not ever sleeping. It was kind of a big stress relief. But then that grief snuck up on me about 6 months later. It all came crashing down. But the people around me didn't understand that. They thought, Walmart gives you 3 days to grieve. Why are you now grieving all of a sudden? And so I was kind of caught in this turmoil of how people were treating me in my grieving process, and then just struggling trying to understand what was going on with myself. I was forgetting a lot. I later found out that that's widow's brain. I suffered from that greatly. And Carolyn had been there for me to answer a lot of those questions. So through that bad experience of just people not understanding what I was going through, when I came to Eureka Springs, I decided that I was not going to allow another widow or widower go through that journey by themselves and be treated in that same manner, and not be able to have a group where we all understood. So I started a widows and widowers group here at this church that's grown to over 30 in our community. We started it as we specifically started it, this is not a church group, this is a support group for widows. And through that,
and widowers.
and
widowers, yeah.
And because of that, many of those widows and widowers, even though I discouraged them from joining my church, ended up joining the church because that group provided them so much spiritual comfort and hope. And I've watched many of those ladies and gentlemen grow to become leaders in their own right, mentoring and shepherding the widows they know in our community. So that's kind of my journey.
So it's a true, because here at Modern Widows Club, of course, we mainly serve women, but of course, knowing you and knowing so many other widowers who really search as well for support, or just a community, right, that gets them, that understands that you can ask all of these questions, like, what is wrong with my brain? We know here at Modern Widows Club, 90% of people who have gone through loss many times have brain fog for 2 years. And so, yeah, that's an eternity for people who have never gone through this before. To us, it just feels like yesterday, right? And so you're living in a different world. And we kind of broke into this really deep conversation yesterday, because of course I'm kind of blown away by how much you understand history, and you understand history in the context of biblically understanding scriptures. And so I've always had some really deep questions about widows in the Bible. And so we broke into this conversation. I've also met everyone in your widow and widowers community, and I've attended twice. And I really especially love what your church is doing with serving both men and women, but also people in both the community, the heterosexual and the LGBTQ community, and they actually converged together at this church. And I think that was something that was really moved me, how supportive each one of the people were with each other, and how they were really interested in each other's story. And it really kind of broke through whatever those traditional separations or divisions were, and it just it was erased. It was gone in that community.
The shared grief experience of widowhood, really broke down those barriers, because we saw each other as broken people going through this journey of widowhood and grief. And many of them had tried grief programs and support groups that didn't work for them because it wasn't geared for widows or widowers. And then we had a huge population of LGBTQ that they had nowhere to meet, because nobody took that seriously when they lost a partner. But the group we started, they immediately understood it's the same pain that straight people have when they lose a spouse. And so we never had the issue of these barriers, because we saw each other as, yeah, I know exactly what you're going through. I know the pain. And it's been a wonderful way. We've had a lot of widows join who have been 5, 6, 7 years out, but they never healed, because they discovered that within our group, I call it kind of like a chip on the shoulder. They knew that they couldn't say anything in our group that none of us had not experienced before. So they couldn't hide behind their grief. And they said, we really appreciate that, because in most groups, we could just simply push people away by saying, you just don't get me. You've never lost a spouse. But here it's like, well, we all have, and we know exactly how you feel.
Well, I think the website, the URL to your church is lovespokenhere.org. And I couldn't agree more with the way you have shown love to hurting people, and not shown division, but unity in the actions, which that got us to start talking about this question that I ask a lot of pastors when I travel. And I asked who was the biggest widow advocate, because the big majority of what I do every day is raise awareness and advocate for widows to be seen and heard, and served and respected and loved, right? And so I come here, and you and I have such a common ideology around this. And so we started talking about Mary, and I started asking you really hard questions about, is faith enough to get us through grief? What's the answer to that question? Because I think a lot of people do come to church, widow and widowers come to church, and there isn't anything specific for them. And so they feel misunderstood. They don't feel like they're with single groups, and they certainly can't go to them. They feel married, but they can't go to the married groups because their partner isn't there. And so we came up, we started asking, is faith enough to get us through grief? And so I'm just going to ask you some hard questions and have you answer them the way you would.
All right. So you want to go with, is faith enough?
Yeah, is faith enough? Because
I think one of the problems in American Christianity is we throw terms around and we put on an act to say, well, I'm a very faithful person. I believe in God. And that means I shouldn't show grief, or I shouldn't show brokenness, because I've been told that if I'm grieving or in pain, somehow I just don't have enough faith.
Yeah.
And I think that is just so far from the truth. And it's so unfortunate that we have taught people to think of faith in that way. I mean, Jesus on the cross, the person we think that has the world's most faith, even said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mm-hmm. That in his moment of trial, he felt utterly broken and abandoned by God. And I don't think we would say, well, Jesus just didn't have enough faith. So on one level of your question, no, faith is not enough to get through grief. If you think faith is this Band-Aid that somehow excuses you from the pain, the trials, the tribulations of the grief process, I don't think it's a sign of weakness or a lack of faith that you feel utterly broken and abandoned. Jesus felt that too. I mean, he wept at the grave of Lazarus. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to be careful when we throw that term faith around, because I think we expect too many people to act a certain way. Well, if you're a real Christian, you shouldn't cry or be grieving if you really believed in the promises of God. And I just think that's a complete distortion of the true meaning of faith. Now, I do think on another level, faith is very important. Faith, in essence, is the trust that at the end of all of this, there is going to be a new beginning, a new chapter, that death is never the last word or the ending of the book. But trust doesn't exempt us from going through the journey of pain. We're going to have suffering in this life, and we're going to be broken. And, the Lamentations of the Bible, the Psalms, all of those are beautiful depictions of people who are broken and empty because of grief and pain and suffering. And those are books we don't often read. But, you pick up the Psalms or Book of Lamentations, and these are the prophets and the writers that are angry at God. Why am I suffering? Why am I so downtrodden? And they just pour out all their human emotion that, yeah, I'm broken, I'm lost, and I'm so angry. Mm-hmm. And if the Bible can show that testimony, I think we can too. I don't think we need to hide behind our faith as, oh, well, I'm a true believer, so I don't feel any of this. And sadly, I run across a lot of widows and widowers that I can see the pain in their eyes, but they've been taught, well, if you're a real Christian, you won't have that. So they bury it deep within inside, and they never face it. And it's just, I think it's tragic that they now walk through life spiritually and emotionally crippled because they were told they shouldn't even deal with it.
And then they never access the path of healing, the path of
Right.
growth that leads to restoration, right? Like there's steps, it's not like love, then grief, then, oh, back to loving life. There's that process is up and down. It's emotional. It's years long. There's no predict. Yes.
It's not stages. You're
Nope.
in and out.
It's experiences.
You're ups and
Yep.
downs. It's a roller coaster. And, you know, for me, and I think for most of my people in my support group, they will testify that this is a journey that doesn't end.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
True.
yeah,
it's true.
You experience grief and your life, that grief never goes away, but your life does continue to grow. But that grief is always there. It's never really diminished.
Mm-hmm.
And in the weirdest of moments, it will just come flooding back on you.
So, so you agree with the statement Jesus was the biggest widow advocate?
I think that's a very, very important perception that a lot of Christians are missing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the Bible, we know that Mary and Joseph were still together when Jesus was age 12, because there's a story of Jesus in the temple at 12. But after that, Joseph disappears from the narrative, and we know at some point he dies. We don't know if he died when Jesus was 13 or if Jesus was 18, but we know at some point in there, Mary loses her husband, her security, her income, and
her protection.
her protection. And I think Jesus would have been deeply aware, especially in the ancient world, what happens to widows and how they're thrown into destitution and poverty and all sorts of horrible outcomes. And so I think, you know, even if he would have been the early age of 13 and experienced this, he would have seen his mother's pain, and he would have been always aware of that. And I think it's very illuminating. And I think we should take this seriously, that really his last concern on the cross as he is dying from one of the most horrific executions you can imagine, his only thought is, John, you are to take care of my mother, because he knows without her son, she is truly bereft of everything. And so even in the midst of that pain and suffering he was enduring, he made sure he took the time that his poor widowed mother was going to be cared for by one of his disciples.
And I bring this story up to pastors all the time, really, and say, Mary was a young widow. I mean, I'm guessing maybe in her 40s, late 40s, or.
Well, I mean, we know from the ancient world, Mary would have been a very young girl when she had Jesus, probably at the age of 14 or 15. I know that's shocking to a lot of people, but when you hit puberty, you were of childbearing age and you were expected to have children. Joseph would have been much older than she was. And so if she was, say, 15 when Jesus is born, she's 30 when he turns 15. When he turns 30, what is she, 45? I mean, that's very young.
And, you know, I never really put this together. I was 37 years old. I certainly, no one told me, hey, you're like Mary, you're a young widow. No one never said that to me. Widows in our culture, widows are the, you know, elders of the church, or in society, the average age of a widow in the United States is 59 years old. When I told you that, you were like, what? I mean, everyone is. And Mary was much younger. She would have been that one of those that brought the age group down.
And I think one of the problems in our religious culture is that if it's not in a little scriptural soundbite, we don't pay any attention to it. We don't look at the stories, and we don't look behind the stories to say, oh, Mary was a widow. What did that mean for Jesus's upbringing? What did that mean, that at the end of his life, the only thing he's concerned about is, who's going to take care of my mom? She's a widow. Somebody has to step up.
He obviously saw how she protected him, made sure he was educated. Obviously, there was probably a lot more empathy and compassion. Makes you wonder, like, the you know, God's heart. And he knew that Jesus would become, well, a fatherless boy, right?
Yes.
I think about my daughters and they lost their father, and it really made me understand and feel closer to Jesus because of knowing this, but no one really ever, I just kind of figured this out. And then asking you the history, like yesterday, I was asking you about, well, widows ministries, right? Like so few places of worship have widows ministries, and yet there's, I don't know, like 76 scriptures in the Bible about caring for widows. And um,
Well, I
it's,
mean, the letter to James, he spells it out very clearly. Pure religion
yes,
is,
yes,
the essence of faith, and all this religious stuff we do is the care and love for widows and orphans. I mean, very straightforward, and yet
yes,
for some reason we ignore that. I was shocked when I started learning how, well, there's hardly any churches that do widows support group.
mhm,
Typically, they're all lumped together in grief support groups. Well, I think a widow's and a widower's grief is far different than any other grief that you can
yes,
experience. And it's a grief that unless you've been through it, you're never going to understand it. Many of my widows here at this church will say, you know, one of the things I feel ashamed of, and they will go back and apologize for later, but they'll say, when my sister or my cousin, when they lost their husband or
mm,
spouse,
yeah,
I was mean to them because I said, why are you still crying? And they
yeah,
go, just had absolutely no concept until it happened to me.
right,
And now I fully understand why 5, 6, 7 years later, they still break out crying because they've passed a
mhm.
favorite memory in the road, and it just brings back all the pain.
We call that the lifting up of the veil, right? Because we're
Yes.
here on this side, and I have a friend who calls the people who haven't experienced the normals, right? The normals don't understand this abnormal kind of experience because we're all doing it for the first time. Well, that led me to ask you some questions that honestly I've never asked anyone before, but I've always wanted to. But it's like, do pastors have to care about widows? They probably actually don't. Like, you have a personal experience of understanding it, but I have to tell you, and that I approach so many places of worship, and I'm not really welcomed. These questions
Right.
are not welcomed. Urging or suggesting or inspiring someone to want to launch a widows ministry, it just kind of falls flat whenever I bring it. I started Modern Widows Club because I was turned down by two places of worship. A widows ministry was like, we just don't have enough people that are here, which was not true, because if I can start a nonprofit and have 45,000 widows around the world, I think they are in our places of worship.
Right.
We don't identify them. We don't understand their needs. We don't ask them what their needs are. So I asked you the question yesterday, do pastors have to care about widows?
I think it's an essential part of their ministry, but the problem is, as a culture, we in America, we try to ignore death. And
Yeah.
grief is something that makes all of us uncomfortable. I mean, I've done sermons in church. Here's what you say to somebody who's grieving. You never say this was God's plan, or they needed another angel. Or I said, frankly, all you
Oh,
need to do is shut up and listen
true,
and be there.
true. Hold
And
space.
they're uncomfortable with with keeping that space because they think they have to say something, they have to do something to fix it, because that's us as
Mm-hmm.
Americans. So I think the fact that we ignore death and the fact that we think we just have to fix grief is a denial of the reality of the pain. Seminary never prepared me for
Yeah, I
widows
asked
and
you.
widowers.
Yeah, I asked you
Uh,
that. It's like,
it's
if,
lumped together in grief. How do you
okay.
deal with grief? Well, I discovered the hard way, widow's grief is vastly different than
Mm-hmm.
other grief.
Right.
And so I don't think a lot of pastors are prepared. I think
Mm-hmm.
I think especially since the overwhelming number of pastors are men, and most men take the path of they almost get remarried immediately, that they
Mm-hmm.
short circuit the grieving process so that they've never really had to face it. and they've kind of gone around it. So they know they don't take it seriously. And when we live in a culture that your bereavement period is 3 days, I think most of us just think, just go get over it and come back to me when you're well.
Well, there was also, I asked you a question, if it's not being specifically taught in seminary or in maybe even like Christian colleges, right, that actually produce a lot of missionaries. If there's no courses on widowhood, we can't expect them to understand it, right? And then on top of that, okay, marriages. We're very much about successful marriages in Christianity. However, none of the marriage classes that I ever took or I know that are out there talk zero about the end of life, about end of life conversations. And yet we know that everyone is going to die. And so why are we not preparing even people who are married to have, you and I both had conversations with our spouses because, well, actually both, I have a medical background and your wife is in the medical industry, but it's also because you experienced loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you knew people like me. So why aren't we teaching how to have conversations around the big decisions that have to happen in marriage too? I would think that that would help.
I think that would be crucial, but I think that's all wrapped up in our denial of death and our avoidance of grief.
Yeah.
My experience was I lost a ton of friends because they just didn't know how to deal with somebody grieving. And it was uncomfortable and they just abandoned me. And that really hurt. But
I recently did this interview for a podcast, and I was saying how I stumbled upon the fact that there were so few places of worship that had widows ministries. I experienced it, but I did not know that that was universally true. We started researching it at MWC, and we found we did this thing called Project Widow 100, and we go into cities like Orlando and Seattle and just varying demographics, and we called 100 places of worship. We did that initially because the women who were coming to Model Widows Club, if you were Jewish, we wanted to share a synagogue, or Catholic, or whatever denomination or background that you were, from a religious or spiritual standpoint. We wanted to be able to plug you in so you could have that, because spiritual health is one of our 7 pillars of healthy widowhood. We know that when you have a strong spiritual life, that it benefits you, right? So we stumbled upon this information. 10 to 15% had anything. And post-COVID, we're checking, that has gone down to like less than 2%. I was blown away, because here people are grieving and during COVID and scared to death for their lives. And we have less support for widows.
Yes. We've had a total of 4 new widows during this pandemic. And we made the conscious decision that we would still allow that support group to meet in a socially distanced manner, because the Zoom was not helping them. They were so cut off, so alone, that we continued the support group, because that's a whole different dynamic. Now you're in a pandemic and your family can't be with you, your friends can't be with you. You can't even have a service unless it's a graveside. So all of those rituals and closures that are normally available to us weren't for them. And it was so painful.
Double isolation, double invisibility, just nowhere to go, right? Yeah, I'm so glad that you decided to do that. And in our communities, of course, they cautiously will do that. And then we, of course, have all of our Zoom.
A few years ago, we did a Widows Sunday. And it was kind of an eye opener, because of what I did. We had a special service, but at the altar, we had a special table, and we invited all the widows and widowers, no matter what your age or how far out you were, to come place a votive candle on the altar. And there were large numbers of people that came down to the front, placed their candles, and there were audible gasps throughout the congregation of, I didn't know they were a widow. Even though you knew they lived alone, you never asked where their husband was. but it was kind of an eye opener
Mm-hmm.
that the congregation never saw the widows and widowers in their midst.
Yeah.
And it was a very powerful moment that raised awareness of these are the people right here.
I really think if more places of worship actually did that and showed um, eh, the real face of widows among them, I think I wouldn't have gotten a no starting a widows ministry. That's for sure. There would have been more people actually going, me too. Like that's,
Yes.
and because people who have become widowed or widower, we don't typically just volunteer our life story, right? We're living it every day. We are looking for some normalcy, and so we don't electively just say, hey, here's my story.
Or, I mean, as widows and widowers, I've
Mm-hmm.
seen a lot of people suppress their story.
Yes,
Because
true.
many of mine here at this church, well, I don't think of myself as that because that was 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. I just thought you get over it and move on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, no, that's not how that works. And maybe come to our support group and talk, and you might see maybe you haven't healed the way you thought you did.
So you updated me on, like, average churches are about 130, 150 people, right? That's
Yeah,
about
correct.
the maximum. And yet your church can start a widows community by offering free space, by offering direction and support from the lead pastor. And here you have this thriving widows community. And so it really does show that if if there is the desire in the heart of the people who lead the church, it can happen. But if you don't have the support, it is actually, I can tell you, really hard because you can't get it started.
Correct.
Yeah.
You have to have it helps to have the pastoral support
Yeah.
that pushes it. But one of the astonishing things, we started this for our church, and then very quickly it morphed into people were coming from the community because they had nowhere else to go.
Well, the word spreads really quickly
Yes.
because of the lack of almost anything that's out there for
And
this
it
community.
was a support group. This was
Mhm.
not a backdoor way to convert you or get you to join
Right.
the church. This was, I stressed over and over, we're not here to do the religious thing. We're here to
Mhm.
do the healing thing and
Right.
the support thing. And that pulled in tons of people. And
Mhm.
I've got widows and widowers. They don't belong to this church, but we're their church. And it's like, but you're an atheist or you're a Buddhist. Yeah, but you're still my church because this is where I found healing. And I think if churches would just step out in faith with that
Mhm.
and take seriously, we need to help these widows and widowers heal and find life, then I think it would transform the places of worship.
It's definitely a sure path to restoration, right? I always tell people it's like what the three main things that are happening with widows is trust. They're looking for is trust, belonging, and opportunity. Until you love someone with authenticity, with genuineness, not as a route to conversion or a route to becoming a member, like conditional love. That's what it feels like when you're receiving it. You're going to have a better response because you haven't earned the right for them to trust you.
Yes.
First of all, they don't feel like they belong. You do, they don't. You have to put yourself in their hands. Then the opportunity is, hey, of course, if they want to know more, then they will go looking for it. Believe me, they will. They're rebuilding their whole new life.
And
So
many of them have gone through a spiritual abuse
yeah.
of a church that took advantage of their grief to try to convert them or get them to join, or didn't take seriously their pain and suffering. And so I've got a lot here that are recovering from the spiritual abuse.
Mm.
And they thank us all the time that we created a safe space for them to be who they were and to share all of their pain without being judged, without being told what they need to do.
Yeah.
We have a rule here that there are no rules in widowhood because we're all going to make these mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important to understand that there is spiritual abuse out there.
Yeah.
And I think too many widows and widowers are preyed upon and not prayed for. And that's something the church has to correct.
It really does. I don't think even people understand how much widows are preyed upon. I mean, I tell people we block 5,000 predators from our Facebook page. People like gasp, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's like everything I do, everything that's posted online, we have to have a team of volunteers ready to like shut them down. And so it's just, I've learned it's the nature of the business of caring about people who are grieving and widow. That word widow attracts people.
The Christian faith is much more than just getting into heaven. It's the eternal life you can have here and now. It's the healing that is here and now. But too many churches are focused on the afterlife, not the here and now. And we're letting far too many people stay broken and stay unhealed because we're too obsessed with something else.
True. Well, with that led us into a conversation, and I want to, because I am so impressed by your history. So I ask a lot of really dumb questions, which turns into like beautiful conversations. So luckily I'm not too scared to ask. But yesterday I was telling you, I said, well, if Jesus was very sensitive to widows, because it would seem like if you're raised by a young widowed mother, right? Because we know that's to be.
And another reason I think Jesus was probably young when his dad died is that you can read in the Gospels, and often the townspeople, when they snicker at Jesus, they will make the comment, well, there goes Mary's son, as if they either have no memory of Joseph being in the picture, which tells me, she was probably widowed when Jesus was very young because of those little comments. They hardly ever refer to him as Joseph's son. It's always Mary's son. And it's almost like a hidden acknowledgement of you're just the son of a widow. Who are you?
Wow, that's so interesting. And then and so we kind of started talking about Mary's life. We know what happened from the cross, and I bring that up to many people. It's like if Jesus asked for Mary to be cared for, literally the last woman he asked for us as believers and Christians to care for, is it not enough for us to do that as well? That is every morning, every night I fall asleep, this is what I do, is raise awareness about this and ask God, where do you want to send me? I think I became widowed to understand this pain and suffering in order to be a greater voice for widows around the world. But then I asked him a question, what happened to Mary? Where'd she go? What happened? Like, what did the scripture say? And then we got into talking about Luke. And so I wanted you to share a little bit about that.
So Luke's gospel was written, say, 40 years after Jesus's death and resurrection. But as you read through it, you'll notice little passages where Luke will make an interesting comment that when the shepherds come to see Mary and Joseph, he will write, and Mary kept these things in her heart and pondered them. And he does that a couple of times throughout his gospel. And those are passages we often overlook, but sometimes you need to stop and say, wait a minute, how does Luke know what's going on in Mary's mind? And for a lot of scholars, a lot of Christians, they believe that Luke, or whoever the writer of Luke was, knew Mary quite intimately, that he must have had access to her thoughts, or else he would not have written in such a manner. So here you go. Luke's gospel could almost be the gospel of his mother Mary, of how she saw the story take place.
So widows, biblically, historically, are wise.
Mary, for that gospel to have been around, to have been written so late, obviously lived a very long life. We know from tradition she was very revered throughout the Christian world during her lifetime. Perhaps she was even some of the earliest Christian leaders of the movement, because of course they would listen to Jesus's mother, and she probably led churches and probably taught and shared the story, because I think it's pretty obvious that's where Luke got his story, is through Mary's eyes. So I think the early church was full of widows. You look at the book of Acts, which is Luke's companion volume to the gospel, but it's the story of the early church. One of the first problems the early church movement has is, what are we going to do with all these widows? The apostles are being overwhelmed by their needs, and so they basically elected a deacons board.
Yeah.
You guys go take care of the widows. And it's like, well, you stop and think about that. Why is the early church attracting such large numbers of widows? And back in the ancient world, widows they were poor, they were destitute, they were nobodies. Often they were forced into prostitution. But there was something about this early church movement that gave them hope, gave them healing, and gave them opportunities to become more than what they were. And I think that's why in the book of Acts, we find in the very early stages, the church is being flooded with widows because they're looking for something and they found it within the church. And I think that something they found is something we've lost because we don't take them seriously.
I agree. And it's always been such a mystery to me that someone who had a fulfilled marriage, that's what widowhood is. Our marriages till death do us part were fulfilled. I've never quite understood why. I know from working with and being around so many widows, the the miracle, the beautiful story, that beauty from ashes story
Mm-hmm.
that is so overlooked, and just completely like invisible. And yet I have these dreams of what happens if the widows are revered, what happens when the widows are valued, how does that change the dynamics of church? Will there be more favor and blessing given upon churches like in the early church? And I did not know the history. You really kind of help put those pieces that I have in dreams together. And then I look at that and go, that's the way it used to be.
Right.
And I had no
And
idea. And then, we started talking about Mary Magdalene and, what was her role in Jesus's life. And there were all these.
so Mary Magdalene,
Yeah.
unfortunately, in history, has nearly been erased. Uh, scribes and the Christian tradition has morphed her story with the story of the prostitute possessed with demons. And that was a deliberate attempt to erase her. We know that Mary Magdalene was a very wealthy, very powerful, very influential woman of the time because she is known as Mary of Magdala. Now, not just anybody gets that ascription to their name. You're known by your hometown if you're somebody important in that hometown. And when you start unpacking that, we know Mary Magdalene supported Jesus financially and those 12 disciples. She went around with them. She had the freedom of movement and she supported them financially, traveling with them. She's one of the first witnesses to the resurrection. She's the first preacher to proclaim the good news. And so when you take her story seriously and you start unpacking it, you start asking, how did Mary Magdalene get to such a position that she had? Because a single woman would never have been afforded those opportunities. They would have been married off and a dowry given to her husband. So I think a lot of us are starting to wonder if Mary was a widow herself. She obviously inherited property, money, position, and power. She obviously had the freedom of movement, which most women did not have if they were married or single. They would have been kept with their original families, or their husband would have kept them at home. But Mary Magdalene has all of this freedom and ability. And I think that only comes from the fact that she is probably a widow herself. Her husband has died. She is now in charge of his estate, and that grants her the independence to be the woman she wants her to be. She wants to be, and she uses that position to support Jesus and his disciples.
When we started talking about this yesterday, I was like, wow, I mean, just think if that's the case, right? Because the widows that I know are extreme givers.
Mhm.
They are extremely intuitive. They're extremely spiritual. They kind of live with a lot of, there's no BS in my life, right?
Right.
They go straight for what is meaningful, what is purposeful. And, and kind of when you study her, you find out about she finds out about Jesus, and
Mhm.
then she meets the disciples and she feels this authenticity, right? I
And
can almost like, yeah,
she also knows Mary, Jesus's mother,
right.
a fellow widow.
And widows attract widows.
Widows.
We know this to be true.
And there are other women in the story that you have to wonder, why do they have so much freedom to move about? And I think only widows had that freedom,
Mhm.
because everybody else would have been married, kept at home, or if they were single, they were still living with their father, and they wouldn't have that freedom of movement.
Mhm.
But these women around Jesus seem to have a lot of freedom. And I think Mary was quite influential. And she probably attracted other widows saying,
Mhm.
hey, my son gets it. He
Eh,
understands.
Yeah, and then throughout the Bible, when we were talking about, um, I had someone the other day tell me who has a large foundation, and she said, "Yes, we give money, but what I admire about you is you give yourself. You give all that you have,
Mhm.
yourself." And we talked about the widow's mite and how amazing that story is, and about what Jesus says. And you can, share the story, because that was another really big influence on me, because when I started MWC, I had no funds. I only had myself to give. And that's when I started just welcoming two widows into my home, because I was asked to, from friends. And that's really how it started. Super simple. It kind of feels like maybe that's what happened with them even. But tell the story about the widow's mite.
So the story of the widow's mite, Jesus is in the temple, and two people come in to give their offering. One is a very rich man who drops in some gold, a very large amount. And then a poor widow comes in and drops in what we now call the widow's mite, which is the smallest coin there is. And Jesus turns to the disciples, because they're all watching this, going, oh, look how much that guy gave. And he says, she gave everything she had. And he's wanting them to think, why did she do that? Why did the wealthy man do what he did? But throughout the Bible, especially the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, there's a reoccurring theme that Israel is told over and over. You better take care of the widows and the orphans, the aliens, the immigrants, the poor, the oppressed. If you don't, then God will take it all from you. And the prophets will repeat that message. We lost everything. We lost the temple. We lost our nation because we took advantage of the widow. We took advantage of the orphan. We didn't take seriously our religious calling to care for these people. And the prophets will say, God didn't give a damn about your religious rituals, your religious clothing. What God cared about is, did you take care of one another? And you failed as a nation, you failed as a people, because you took advantage of widows and orphans. And I think widows would have been attracted to the Jewish religion, because that is such a prominent position of the Jewish law.
Mhm.
You must take care of these people. They must be cared for and never forgotten. And the prophets would repeat that over and over. And I think that's what Jesus was pointing out to his disciples. Who's doing the better work? The one who's given all, or the one who's giving the money to be noticed?
Mhm.
And so that's the story of the widow's mite that I
It,
think we should take seriously.
and it's funny because we rarely talk about these things, but for me, it's always been this question, because I like to think, what if, right? Like, what if every place of worship, what if the 2.2 billion Christians around the world started caring for the 300 million widows that exist in the world now, that are caring for 600 million fatherless kids? These are real numbers.
Mhm.
What would actually happen? What kind of favor, what kind of, how much joy would come into so many Christians' lives and bring so much joy to God himself, right? Go back to what the early church was doing and not forget these mandates, and start doing the hard work of figuring out what that is. I think that, you look at in the US, we've got about 1.2 million nonprofits, right? And if you go over there and you look in the GuideStar or whatever, you've got about maybe like a couple thousand widows organizations. Modern Widows Club is one of them, but the majority of them are mission trips outside the country. And yet the United States is the third largest country with widows, behind India and China. We're about 15% of the population of every country. So when you look at, people, when I tell people we have about 15 million widows in the United States, they're just like, what? It's just something that's not told around the world. So widows are in our places of worship, or they wish they had one. Like your church, right? They started coming because the word got out that there was someplace safe and loving for them to be understood.
They're noticed.
Yeah.
They're seen.
Yes.
A lot of my widows have said, we left our church because we came and we were invisible without our spouses, and we were ignored, and it was so uncomfortable. But here we come, and just, even though there are married couples, we don't feel that because we see all the other widows,
Right.
and they surround us with love and care.
Right.
So we don't feel abandoned or neglected. We feel community again.
Yes.
And I think that's the big thing churches are missing out on. If they don't create a widows community, they're not going to have the space for them. And those people will leave because they don't want to feel like the odd person out. They don't want to feel ignored or abandoned. And when you don't have that space for them, they will find it somewhere else.
They slip away in the night.
Yes.
It's painful, and I know this from personal experience, to come to church and stand alone amongst so many couples and families around me. They are all supported, but it took a lot of courage for me to show up and to receive what I needed, right? But I did feel extremely invisible. I was always invited to
think of
singles groups and
think of the voices and talents that walk out the church door. Because you neglected the widow, they felt unwelcome and they leave, and they take their voice, their talent, their gifts, their graces with them, and your church is left with missing that. And looking around the world with so many widows who are caring for so many orphans, I've always been a firm believer that the kingdom of God is here with us, and that when we ask God, why is this happening? Why is that happening? God is whispering, why are you allowing that to happen? I think we have everything we need to change the world. The problem is we're letting these voices be abandoned and neglected. Think of those orphans the numbers you mentioned. Within those numbers, how many of them are the next Mozart or the scientist that discovers the cure for cancer? But their voices are never going to be heard because churches are not caring for them. And so they struggle in poverty, they struggle in loneliness, and they never have the avenue to excel. And think of the widows who contribute, that could contribute so much, but we've kind of turned our backs on them. I think it cripples the church.
Yeah, I always say a formidable woman is a terrible thing to waste. I feel like so many, I felt it, right? Like I was like, I have something to give. And so I went and did my own thing, right? And now here I am consulting with places of worship. When you have 400 widows and you're not sure what to do, or you don't know how to have a widow's breakfast, sometimes it's just a matter of like your widows group had a burning bowl where you write something that you're willing to release and let go of, and you burn it in a fire. There's many ways that you can acknowledge women, widows on Mother's Day. You can acknowledge them on International Widows Day on June 23rd. There's so many different ways that you can welcome the widows. And the beautiful thing about widows is they're our mothers, they're our grandmothers and our aunts and our daughters and sisters and nieces. And we can't do life in the world without them. They're too precious.
And
And
it's not something that happens to certain couples. It's going to happen to every couple. And I think that's
yes,
something we don't want to imagine, but it's going to happen.
yeah,
And wouldn't you want your spouse to
yeah,
have that safe space, that they have a community, or would you rather your spouse have to slip away in the night
yeah.
and be forgotten? I think that's something we forget.
Yeah. And Blake and I are working on a project right now because we really do want to create something that can help activate more widows ministries easier, or widows communities. You don't have just to launch a whole ministry just for widows. You can bring widows together in a community, and uh,
You don't have to have a
the
psychology degree. You
yeah,
don't have
the
to have
widows will rise up,
expertise.
yeah, and start leading these
Yeah, you just
communities.
need the space. You create
Yeah.
the space where they can meet and invite them, and they'll take care of it. And we
Mhm.
want to do something that gives them that tool.
Right.
But that's going to take churches and Christians taking this seriously.
Yeah.
And I think if the Bible says religion boils down to the love of widows and children, maybe we should take that seriously. And maybe if the Savior we
Yeah.
worship, his last act was to make sure his widowed mother was cared for, if that was such a priority for him, maybe it needs to be for us as well.
I agree. And both of us are doing that, and we're here. You can reach Blake at lovespokenhere.org, and you can reach me at modernwidowsclub.org. And thank you so much, Blake, for having
Thank
on
you,
this
Carolyn.
webinar.